really like estuary scenes. But what I was going to add to this little lesson, you know, in the sort of mostly in the stuff that I sent out in the pack is the usual advice. But as you know, I like to sort of add a few extra sort of tips and hints during the process. And what I'm going to sort of bring your attention to a bit in this one is shapes again, is how we use shapes and how we see shapes in a general sort of form. Okay. And what I mean specifically here is it's good to repeat similar shapes. Let me just put that out the way and I'll show you exactly what I mean by this. When looking at that photo, we have the obvious, you know, it's an estuary, there are rocks next to water. Rocks, we could, you know, you don't, and it's a bit like, it's quite poignant actually because of the conversation we had with Mashiko. There are stones, there are always stones. This is familiarity. This is being familiar with your subject matter before you even paint it. There are always large stones. They seem to be clad in this yellow seaweed here in this photo. But we know that there will be stones in this territory because we can see them elsewhere. That can't be anything other than loose stone. Okay. Now then, identify your shapes and use the repetition. So they'll be in the wall. You can expect to see similar shapes in the wall. You can expect to see similar shapes down here in the foreground in the larger stones. And anything that even remotely resembles that shape. So you see, even the window, this is where it gets a bit more interesting. So we've moved from these sort of shapes to window shapes. You know, you could, if you start sort of dissecting it and start analyzing it too much and you say, hang on a second, how is a window the same shape as a rock? It is. It's a perfectly square rock, but we try not to paint our windows perfectly square. Okay. So the point I'm picking up on is that if you can see a repeated pattern, a repeated shape anywhere, use it, grab it with both hands and use it. There's even one there, this little building, this little tower, mini tower. I would call that is a very simple shape, you see. You know, let's move it up here, wait and see what I'm doing. I'm seeing that shape as just another repeated shape. I recently did a painting, and I do them a lot. I do sort of, I do old cottages, you know, the cottage is something like this. And in front of this cottage, there's a stone wall. And if you look at the shapes in the foreground that make up the wall, okay, they're probably something like this, aren't they? Sort of, you know, in random slightly, but nevertheless, very similar shapes overall. They change in size and they change at their edge a bit, but basically the essence of those shapes is very close, very similar. So this is again where it gets interesting. I see the window of the cottage as two similar shapes. You know, you could place that window down here in the wall. Nobody would be any different. Nobody would know any different. They would assume that those were stones in the wall. In the house, they're the window. What about the chimney? The chimney is yet another shape, very, very similar. And this is where you can depart from being bogged down with detail. Okay, try to find similar shapes of repeated shapes. Repetition is good, but it has to be broken repetition. There is bad repetition. Bad repetition would be doing something like this. Would be to say there were some conifer trees at the back of this building and they were all uniform. That's unbroken repetition. That's very neat, precise, regimented repetition. That's not good. You know, you'd have the tree trunks. And although we don't think we do that, our brains do. Our brains want to organize things in very neat patterns. Okay, we have to fight as artists who lean towards a more loose style, more impressionistic, even slightly abstract style. artists that chose to go down that route need to depart from, need to be very, very disciplined to move away from what we're hardwired to do as children, you know, is to place everything neat. Things must make sense. They must be tidy and neat. It will be one of the hardest things you have to do, is to move away from this stuff and think more like this. Yes, you've got similar shapes. Yes, you're repeating those shapes, but you break the monotony of it. You break the symmetry. Okay, you've got to break out of the symmetry. Hope that makes sense. Okay. So let me just get this sketch in for a moment. I'm sort of referring to my sketch. I think it's time, you know, I always try to paint loose, you know that, but I think this would be a good, given what's been sort of brought up recently, what's coming to light through things like the critiques that we're doing. I think it's necessary for me to do an even more looser painting this week than I would normally do. So I'm not going to worry about this space here, okay? On my original sketch, I've cropped that a little bit, but I'm going to move things a little bit this way. So I said, that's a sketch. That's just to get me off the ground. When it comes to doing the painting, I'm that bit wiser because I've done a sketch. I might not copy the sketch exactly, and that's why I advise you guys not to, because the sketch is just your first attempt at getting things how you want them. So I'm just going to bring in this building as though it's a little bit closer to us on the right-hand side. And then I'll show you how I find the repeated objects in a moment. I'm just getting this design and getting the design sorted first here. So there's the harbour wall. There's a building. There's a building, as far as I can see, it's just that shape there. I'm not interested in what the building serves. Is it the kitchen area of what looks like a pub or something like that? That's not important. All that's important is that I find the shape. So, as I say, I'll get to this thing about repeated shapes in a moment. Let's just get the big shapes in here. And then coming across, so the eye line then, okay, the all-important eye line. If we look at the photo, all we need to know is this, is that the eye line comes, this little building here that I've got, this little wedge shape here, the horizon line or eye line, because they're the same thing, cuts almost up to the height of that building, perhaps halfway up that measurement, so about there. So there's your eye line. That's your disappearing, vanishing point. Okay, you can't see any further than that. That's as far as the eye can see. As I say, you can call that line what you want. The horizon line, the eye line. If this wasn't a seascape, the sea here, and it was just open flat fields or landscape, that's exactly the same line. It's the point at where the eye would not be able to see any further than. I've got to reduce that. If you're not used to drawing horizontal lines like this, there is no shame whatsoever in measuring this off the edge of your paper. So I normally got a ruler to hand. So if I've said that's my horizon line there, because I know, because I've looked at the photo and it's told me that it's there, it comes off this building there. And all I have to do is just make a pencil mark at the bottom of my board and check that it's the same there. And it's really important actually, if you were to be able to see through the buildings, that horizon line finishes about there. So you can, as I said, there's no shame in using straight edges, measurements to get that eye line. And that's something you, as I say, you need to sense after a while. And a little session at the seaside, where you can see, where you have the luxury of being able to see that situation, see the sea, excuse the pun, you do develop a sense for it. Right, let's finish this sketch. So by making some observations, okay, we can now, because we made that observation from this point here, we can now sort of say, well, look at that. That wall over here on the left is almost at the height of the horizon line. And it comes in, and I guess these measurements usually, sometimes I need to correct them, but I guess them to start off with. And then it comes in from a shallowish angle, something like this. Now, only your sense of what is right and what is wrong, visually, I mean, will tell you exactly how to play this edge off over on here, this side of the river, to this side. And I tend to sort of study the photo and say, well, its narrowest point is about here where it meets the sea. And there seems to be a shape like this as the rocks tumble down towards the water. If you, in your head, think that this is the water area here, roughly speaking, that's got to be flat. That water surface there, despite the movement of the water itself, is flat. So it's always parallel to your horizon line, okay? So there's your horizon line. If you bring it down and keep the board and the straight edge parallel to that line, you can tell yourself that's the flat of the water. Okay, the water is like, whoops, make that better. So you could say that the water sits like this. If it were perfect, if it were to freeze over, you know, and there was no movement in that water, you could say that it's perfectly flat like that. Whereas the rocks and stones that sit on the bank and the edge, that's a textured, that's completely different. That's a completely different little story on its own. Okay. And the stones that come in on the bank here. Now then, let's get to that thing about repeated shapes. I've already mentioned that the stones are going to dominate. They're right up here. We're going to exaggerate them as well. And that's another thing, another fault of using a photograph. You know, there's so many pitfalls in using photographs. You don't ever get the same sense of scale with a photograph. These stones here, that sort of bending of the lens, the fisheye effect, will push things slightly away from us at the edges. Okay, so we want to show these off, and even if that wasn't the case, it's always wise to exaggerate your perspective by bringing these rocks and things up here into our face much bigger. When they get to about here, things get smaller. Okay, repeated shapes. Trying not to make them all look like footballs, so we'll elongate some of them, because that way they'll look similar to some other things we're going to find. So as I say, I always use the word lozenge. Lozenge is a good shape, and you tilt the lozenge horizontal, you tilt the lozenge diagonally like this, tilt the next lozenge shape, you know, in the opposite diagonal, to make the next lozenge shape almost perfectly vertical like that. And this is repetition, broken repetition. So where else do these shapes appear? We know that this shape here is good. It's similar to these shapes we've already mentioned. I want to move it this way, okay? So I'm moving, instead of placing it where it is in the photo, which is about here, just going to bring it forward to about there. So you can make it look more like the object that it really is when you get to paint it. But for the moment, it's a repeated shape of what's in the foreground. Windows, it may be a square rectangle, vertical rectangle like that. Sorry, a square, that's a contradiction. It's a vertical rectangle. Look how close it is to some of these shapes down here. Okay. These are windows. You can give them all the same what's the word, symbol. Okay. The chimneys, the same. Okay. Now I don't think you'll find the opportunity to do this type of thing in every scenario. There'll be certain subject matters where you will struggle to repeat objects. But the reason why I'm bringing it up is because it's often what makes us choose one potential subject matter we want to paint over another. If we look at a subject matter and think, well, there's not much being offered there, I can't repeat anything, there's not, it's a bit bland, you know, these are why we choose, some of the reasons why we choose to paint one scene rather than another scene. So I've got some similar, I just think of them again as just lozenge windows, chimneys. I think it could be overkill if we started putting exactly the same shape in the wall. There's that point I hasten to add. The caveat here is that like anything, you can overdo certain things. So look at this. Let me just show you what I've got then before I start painting. I haven't looked at the sky because let's forget the sky for now. We've got a shape, and I am just looking at the photograph here. We've got a shape here of it looks man-made. It looks like it's possibly at one time a huge amount of concrete that they've created this almost triangle here. Okay, something like that, isn't it? Okay, and then in the wall, the size of the lozenge shapes in the wall are too small to make too much of. So we can say, well, we won't bother too much about the wall. We'll just texture that, infer that type of surface by the way we apply our paint, rather than delineate shapes as we're doing down here and here and here and here and here. There's another line comes up here, of course. But again, that left-hand side is nondescript. It could catch us out, but I'll try and explain how I tackle it when we get there. There's not much to this left-hand side. It serves only as a punctuation mark. If we're reading the story, you know, as we do tend to do it clockwise, all that's there is something to keep you on the left rather than slip out of the painting. It just keeps you there, but you find yourself coming back over here where all the interest is. Okay, focal point wise, okay, now it's your shout. It's either here where these chimneys meet the sky, okay, and where all this geometrical stuff resides in the design, okay, or you could use this area down here, but it's not brilliant, it's not positioned perfectly, but you could, you know, I bring up design and composition a lot because it's so important, but you know, I will take my hat off to anybody that can make that can step outside these rules and still make their painting work. So just bear that in mind. It's always a reliable thing to do is to stick to a certain amount of aesthetic rule, okay, and then break other rules as you see fit. Right, so there's my drawing. Let's get some paint going here. Now, this is probably where you need to pick up the big round brush or the mop brush if you use one like I do for these sort of situations. You can use the 1-inch flat brush if you so choose for the sky. Let's make life easy for ourselves and just place up a bit of water, roughly speaking. So delivery of water, okay. Notice I just apply it off the belly of the brush. I'm not putting water on. I'd be there all day if I was to try and put water on here with the point of the brush. Just sweep it across with the belly of the brush like that. I'm going to pick up a little bit of phthalo blue and then add a little bit of ultramarine blue to that. And we'll just allow that to swim in. More or less, I'm looking at the photograph for this. And as we come down to the sky, things get weaker, okay? Same sort of shapes, but only a little bit tighter together. And we'll put a little bit of warmth in here. I don't see much evidence of that in the photograph. Again, you know, why doesn't the photograph show that warming up of the lower sky? Because it's nearly always there in real life. So I'm picking up a little bit of raw sienna, tiny bit of alizarin crimson with that, a lot of water, very weak. It's just enough to warm up that lower part of the sky down there. And I've got a funny little thing going on around my chimney. I don't like that. You see this? So I'm cleaning the brush that I've just been using in the water, and I'm leaving a very small amount of water in there. I just want to get rid of this hard-edged white shape. What I'll do is I'll make sure that the paintbrush lands in the dry white shape, and I'll push out, do the same thing, clean the brush, land it back in there, okay, on the dry white area, and push into the wet area like that. And that's a great way. That's a way of softening an edge without, you know, without creating just another hard edge somewhere else, because that's what would happen if you started landing the brush in the paint rather than on the dry spot in the first place. There we are. That's a much better effect when that's a softer edge. Okay, let's so with the point of the brush now, so I do use the point of the brush, but you know, compared to how much I use the belly of the brush, it's really a much smaller amount of use of the point of the brush. Okay, I've got a similar thing there. I'm just making good that edge there. So let's get some warmth in. So if you remember, I picked up a little bit of raw sienna for the lower part of the sky with a little bit of alizarin crimson in it. And I'm just going to, this is the point of the brush because it's a very linear shape. Just go across there, okay? But for this bigger, bolder shape, it's back to the, this is a much bigger shape over here on the right. So I'm back to the belly of the brush like this. Raw sienna, little bit of alizarin crimson in it. Same here, back to the belly of the brush just to sort of upset, if you like, disrupt that that paint delivery. Now that was a warm color, so why don't we pick up a little bit of the sky color, the blue that we had mixed, and drop that in places, perhaps around here like that, into the wall. Belly of the brush, into the lower part of the wall over here, belly of the brush. Only when I have to taper the shape like that do I turn to the point of the brush. Okay, now we'll be going back into all of these areas, of course, when, you know, just to sort of beef things up a bit and give things a bit of extra weight. I've noticed there's a much darker water line at the base of the wall. So why don't we pick up a bit of burnt sienna, because that's a darker color than the raw sienna, add a bit of ultramarine blue to that. Okay, less water, much less water, and a lot more paint. And we'll drop that in just to demark that, just putting a little bit more of the burnt sienna, the ultramarine blue in here. And this is, as you can see, all still wet. This is the beauty, the luxury of you get of by working quite rapidly. Okay. And we know that this is much darker, so I can apply a bit more dark down here. So particularly the darkness stays down here, this end of this concrete walkway. So most of the, don't take the dark right to the end, not yet. We'll put some dark dry brushwork down there in a moment. Now I can see a shape over the wall at the back along the coast there, along the above the water line. Does something like that. So a little bit of use of the point of the brush. And I want to paint that, but of course all the area of sky is still wet, so I can't put that little building in, whatever it is, until that's all dry. I could speed dry it, but I don't see the point in doing the speed drying it when I can be doing other things. I can see shapes in the buildings that look something like this. There's my, for now at least, there's my windows. Hit there, hit there. Chimney is quite warm, reddish color, so with plenty of burnt sienna in there. And although just about in the photo, we can just about see a chimney here. And if the photo had been cropped even further and I couldn't see a hint of a chimney, I'd have put a chimney in there anyway. Just, you know, by working this way, you keep your paintings loose. So I'm just picking up a little bit of burnt, keep calling ultramarine blue burnt sienna. Ultramarine blue, just to cool off some of those windows, the ones, and darken them, the ones that are over here. Have to do, see, the window at the end of this building is not dark at all, it's light, but we're going to get far more value from a dark shape here than a light shape. We're going to get far more impact. Things over the wall, I don't know what they are. I'm not concerned as to what they are. They're obvious. They're very typical shapes. That's all I would sort of say. I describe them as very typical shapes. They're the edges of roofs. They're perhaps the top of a car, even maybe that's parked behind this wall. It doesn't really matter what it is. It's a shape that's worth putting in your painting, or it's a shape that's not worth putting in your painting. That's the only thing. That's my only decision. That's the basis of my decision. I'm going to go down a size for a moment and just, in fact, I'm going to turn to the rigger brush and we'll use an ultramarine blue mix with burnt sienna. So it's time to sort of think as though we're back to doing a bit of drawing a little bit here. I'm going to run some lines at the edges of things. I like to break lines, so as you see me, as you probably saw me do there, I'll make a line like this, like that, to delineate the shape that we were talking about earlier, like that. And if I find the line is too heavy, then I'd simply just run a finger through it like that and smudge it off in places. What if we were to sort of just paint in some of these larger rocks? Now, if we like the yellow of the seaweed, that's not a problem. Once we've formed the shapes, we can put that yellow seaweed in with a wash. I just want to have some fun creating some of these closest stones. Probably not a good idea to go beyond about this point where my finger is, when in terms of, you know, outlining stones. Beyond that, they're just specks like that. Just the touch of the point of the brush, something like that, that will suffice. But round here, we can enjoy making these shapes. There's a couple in the water here. What will be the water? Now that may look quite crude, and it does, but I know that what's going to be done over the top of that is going to make that look quite natural. I put the odd little rock that's fallen into this area here because it's not really evident in the photograph. I don't see that, but it would look better if we just broke this otherwise flat area up with the odd stray shape like that over here. Now we've got a much smaller version over on the left-hand side. So probably going to go with a bit more blue and a bit more water. I'm just mixing up the same colors, only with a bit more blue and a bit more water, because these are smaller shapes. They're the same shapes as these across here, but they're smaller because they're that, you know, they're that bit of perspective on them. They're just that bit further away. So same over here. These are further away, smaller and further away. And I really want to break up the channel of water here. It's quite narrow when you look at it. And it's mostly dark. So when we get to painting it, that's something else we need to be mindful of, is just how dark the water is. So we probably do need to keep this a pale color, even whether we decide to go with the photograph color, which is a pale greeny yellow or yellowy green. That's the tonal value I'm talking about. I'm calling it a color, but it's the tonal value that I concern myself with. So that light tone will sit next to the dark tone of the water. Okay. So just being that sort of one step ahead all the time before you get there. Now then, I'm still on the rigger brush, and I'm still thinking like I'm drawing, and I'm just chasing out these around the window, perhaps a little bit like that, down the edge of the roofs, like this. Along the edge of the roof, something like that. I have to move my palette out the way here because it's in the way of my arm movement. There we are. And maybe something that comes down off the roof like this, showing the angle of that roof there. And again, we can go sort of a little bit around windows. There's all sorts of things going on underneath this more shady area at the lower level. So I've got to make up an area there at the end of that little lower roof. I've got to make that up. So it just looks as though it comes this way a bit. As you can't see from the photo. So, yeah, you know, again, it's worth mentioning that I think if we were to look for the perfect photo every time, we would never get a painting done. I've got lots and lots of photos. Most of them I've painted, and trust me, it is very easy to think to have a reason for not painting any of them because it's not perfect, it's not this or it's not that, or it doesn't have that. And then you suddenly realize that's not what it's about. The photo is there to give you an idea only. You know, and again, I've got to say too, I fully understand why we on some occasion we need a bit more information from our photos. But you've got to be so careful not to fall into the trap of, well, you know, if the photo doesn't fit, then I can't paint it. It should be the other way around, really. Try to paint from photos that really don't offer that much. You'll soon find your creative brain. So I'm just putting in what I think I can see in that building there. Just enough information to tell us more or less what it is. Now there's railings along here, but they're light colored. They're like anodized aluminium or steel or whatever. Sorry, steel rails, but they're pale in color. Well, that's not going to work unless I were to darken the area and use white gouache at the end, which you could do, of course. So I'm painting them in like this with some extra excuse me, with some extra sort of dark detail around in places. Coming down the wall, if I want to tell my viewer that this is a wall, I'll use a bit of vertical line like this. It does sort of clash with the railings above a little bit, but that's okay. It's not, I don't think it's information overload by any means. So that's what I meant earlier about. I've come to this point at the end down here, and I've used a little bit of drier paint, dark paint down here to tell our viewer that things come to an end down here. This is all open sea from that little point onwards there, where my finger's pointing. That's where the little river meets the ocean. So I'm just coming down here. Just making a rugged line, a really sort of broken line here that gets bigger and bigger and bigger. Okay. Just going to put some dry brush work, not too much here, as we can sort of see these sort of lines in the wall. Now we're pretty close to going back to what is there seems to be something here. It's probably a window on this end building here. Two little lozenge shapes. Yeah, I'm just going to speed draw. I don't think there's much damp there still alive there, but I don't want any, so I want to make sure that what I do next, because I'm looking at putting on another wash now, going back to the big brush.